All right, good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Keras Circle. Keras Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Keras Books. And Keras Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. Keras is really proud and excited to welcome Yousef M. Aljamal in conversation with Dr. Ilise Benshushan Cohen for a discussion of Light in Gaza, Writings Born of Fire. Imagining the future of Gaza beyond the cruelties of occupation and apartheid, Light in Gaza is a powerful contribution to understanding Palestinian experience. This event is co-sponsored by the American Friends Service Committee and the Jewish Voice for Peace Atlanta chapter. We are honored to get to work with both of these important organizations. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Ilise Cohen first, who is our interviewer tonight. Ilise is here in Atlanta and has been an activist, organizer, and educator on Palestine and Israel for 3 decades. Her doctorate in post-colonial anthropology expanded her scholarship on systemic discrimination and state violence to include Mizrahi Jews in Israel. As a Sephardic Jewish woman, she was excited to be a co-founder and co-coordinator of the first U.S. Jews of color, Sephardi, and Mizrahi caucus, and was part of the leadership team for forgive me for not knowing how much, Sedic, thank you, an international Jewish network focused on Palestinian freedom. Ilise has written numerous articles and contributed to the anthologies on anti-Semitism, solidarity in the struggle for justice, and reclaiming Judaism from Zionism, stories of personal transformation, both of which we have gotten to celebrate in Keras on various ways. Ilise is co-founder of the Atlanta chapter of Jewish Voice for Peace and lives in Decatur with her family. So thank you, Ilise, for bringing this event to us, making this happen tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, and the person of the hour tonight is Yousef M. Aljamal. He is a Palestinian refugee from Al-Nusierat refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. He has obtained an MA degree from the Department of International and Strategic Studies department at the University of Malaya. He is now a PhD candidate at the Middle East Institute at Sakarya University in Turkey. Besides his research interests in diaspora, security, and indigenous studies, he has contributed to a number of books which highlight the Palestinian narrative. He translated 2 books on Palestinian prisoners entitled The Prisoners Diaries, Palestinian Voices from the Israeli Gulag, which came out in 2013, and Dreaming of Freedom, Palestinian Child Prisoners Speak, which came out in 2016. He also co-edited the book A Shared Struggle, Stories of Palestinian and Irish Hunger Strikers, which came out in 2021. He has published a number of journal articles on topics that include Palestinians in the diaspora, travel restrictions imposed on Palestinians, and struggles for liberation. Over the years, he has spoken at various forums and platforms to highlight the plight of Palestinians living under Israeli military occupation. And he is the author of Light in Gaza, Writings Born of Fire, which we are here to celebrate tonight. So I want to welcome all our folks who are watching with us virtually and let you all know that you can ask questions in the chat, and I will vocalize those to the folks in the room and all of our folks who are here with us in the room. We've got a great crowd for folks watching at home. Y'all can ask questions too. I'll bring you the microphone. We do just want to make sure that we're always speaking into the microphone so that folks can hear all of the beautiful words that are going to be said tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to Ilise. Thank you so much for starting this out.
Thank you again so much for having us. Excuse me. So I'm super excited to be here with Yousef, one, because we met several years ago in 2014 when he first came to Atlanta on a book tour with Gaza Writes Back. And so I just want to encourage that if folks have not read his article in there or other articles in that book, that's also something that you should be excited to read. And so I'm just going to ask a series of questions to Yousef, and hopefully he'll be able to share with us about the chapter that he wrote in this book, Light in Gaza, and then also get to share with us some other thoughts beyond that, and also reflect on some of the other chapters. So why is this book? What is this book, and what does it aim to achieve?
Thank you, Ilise. Thank you for being here today. Thank you to the organizers. I would like to also thank the American Friends Service Committee for making this speaking tour possible. We've been touring different cities in the United States from Chicago to New York and Boston, Philadelphia, DC, Milwaukee, and finally Georgia, Atlanta. And it has been an exciting experience and talking to people in many different places. The first in-person post-COVID event, so it's exciting to see all of you. Going back to the book, so we have 16 contributions in the book, written by 12 Palestinian authors. And the book is an attempt to envision the future of Gaza and Palestine, written by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip mostly, but also Palestinians from Gaza who live elsewhere, and Palestinians in the West Bank who also care about, their brothers and sisters in Gaza. So it's an attempt to break the siege and imagine the future of Palestine and Gaza away from travel restrictions. There are chapters that talk about using artificial intelligence, for example, to improve or architecture to improve the lives of Palestinians. There are chapters about agriculture and how it has changed because of colonial policies over the years. Also, chapters talking about the intellectual siege and isolation imposed on Palestinians there. So it's an attempt by Palestinians to break the siege and provide some solutions and ideas. So connecting Palestinians, for example, in my chapter, how we could overcome travel restrictions imposed on Palestinians. And also centering the debate about Nakba and the notion of the ongoing Nakba, because 70% of Gaza's population are refugees, including my family. And, providing solutions that talk about, for example, humanitarian aid, which is needed, is not enough, because without solving the issue of Palestinian refugees. And the fact that Gaza's population has tripled overnight in 1948, and now from 100,000 to 300,000 in 1948, and now in 10 years, the population of Gaza will hit 3 million. We have almost 5,000 to 6,000 Palestinian babies born every month. Palestinians are working very hard. We're trying to think about ways to imagine the future. What is the future of the next generation? Where will they live? Like, do they have enough housing, agriculture, schools? The healthcare system is collapsing and catastrophic in many ways. Freedom of movement. How will Gaza look like? Because very often people talk about, for example, or at least Israel, the natural growth of Israeli settlements. What about the natural growth of Palestinians in Gaza? The geography of Gaza has been shrinking over the years. It was larger than what we know today. It used to be called Qada Gaza, with 54 Palestinian villages, as Asma Abu Mizyad mentions in her chapter, and all of a sudden we ended up with 365 kilometers, around 140 miles, with a huge population that needed housing. And in fact, the AFSC was one of the first organizations to help Palestinian refugees. And then 2 years later, in 1950, UNRWA came and took over the responsibilities of Palestinian refugees. But these needs have always been increasing, and like the education sector, the health sector, the infrastructure in Gaza has many challenges. And imagine like living under occupation without access to resources, and the need to expand. You need a permit even to build a hospital in Gaza, and then let alone allowing medical equipment and medical teams and training people. Everything needs a permit. So we try to imagine the future in the book, and the contributions, as I said, were made by Palestinians imagining the future of Gaza. We had a team of editors, but also supervisors. 3 people edited the book. Jihad Abu Salim, who's originally from Gaza, Jennifer Bing, and Mike Merriman Lotz, who both of them, 3 of them actually worked with the FSC. We had also editors, US academicians who guided the authors throughout different stages. It's ironic because, in 2021, in May, the book had to stop. The project had to stop because Israel, was attacking Gaza. And so living the experience, I think one of the most important contributions is that we have experiences from the ground of people who live in Gaza. They imagine or lived in Gaza. And they try to envision a future away from siege, isolation, including the intellectual siege and isolation imposed on Palestinians, in order to provide some solutions or to have a debate that centers Gaza, not in isolation, but in connection with the rest of Palestine and in connection to the question of Palestinian refugees.
I think one of the things that was so powerful about the book so far, of what I've read, is both the centering the voices in Gaza and also being able to say what are the details. Like there's so much discourse and language about, Gaza is an open air prison. There are this many people who live in Gaza and there are restrictions, but there's not really so much of the human element that gives you an opportunity to really understand what that means, especially Gazans, people who have never ever left and have only known being under siege. So I know that your chapter talks a lot about particularly travel restrictions and the impact on your family, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
It's important to always connect every single chapter in the book, including mine, to 1948, the year Palestinians were ethnically cleansed. My family comes from a village called Aqir in central Palestine, and the village was ethnically cleansed by Zionist militias. My great-grandfather was killed in the village just before they had to leave, and my extended family was split from day one in 1948 into 2 geographies. The Gaza Strip, that's where my father's side of the family ended up. The other half of my family ended up in the West Bank. So we have always lived with the psyche and the implications of travel restrictions. So for 19 years, my family was split. They were not able to meet each other because meeting each other means that they had to travel through Jordan and Egypt, which was not affordable after 1948 because of poverty. The situation of Palestinian refugees was miserable. Ironically, they were reunited under occupation in 1967 when Israel finished the job and occupied the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. My family was finally allowed to, meet physically. I talk about also the intergenerational aspect of the suffering of the Palestinian people, that it impacted my grandfather, also it impacted my father and parents, my mother, my sister, and me now, and my nephews and nieces. So it's been going on for 74 years, and it's impacting every single Palestinian generation, one after another. There are some stories in my chapter that are funny about travel restrictions. Other stories are not. So one of them is about my father, who worked in Israel in the 80s. And there were a lot of Palestinians who worked in Israel as cheap laborers at the time. Ironically, many of them worked in Israeli settlements. And one time he was going back. So I grew up in what used to be a prison, literally, during the First World War. In Block A, or Kalabosh as we call it, it comes from a Turkish word, which means shackles and chains. So kalabche means chains, and Ottoman soldiers were held in this prison, Block A. That's why they call it Kalabosh, like it has to do with Kalabsher, the Egyptian slang, and Palestinians in Gaza sometimes use Egyptian slang. And I literally grew up there. And I always grew up with this psyche of being in a prison, or what used to be a prison. So we always had Israeli patrol units watching our movement in and out and humiliating us, breaking into our houses and looking for children who they accuse of throwing stones. So this is my memory of the first Palestinian Intifada. I was too young. And there were a group of soldiers who break into our house and they were looking for Palestinian children or stone throwers. One time, my father was going back, as I said, from his daily job in Israel, and these Israeli soldiers stopped him at the entrance of what used to be the prison. So the gate of the prison is actually now the gate in and out of the refugee community where I grew up, literally. And this is the only way in and out of the community. Hundreds of people who live there, and the only way for them to get in and out is to go through what used to be the gate of the prison. So they stopped my father and they asked him to dance. And this was very common in the first Palestinian Intifada, to stop Palestinians, humiliate them, ask them to collect garbage and dirt, or remove a Palestinian flag somewhere. In my father's case, they asked him to dance. And, my father never danced in his life, I guess. And it's very difficult, especially this was their way of humiliating him, because in the Arab culture, especially like my father's generation, they never dance or smile until they get, I think, 83. That's when they So they asked him to dance, and he had no option. So there were like a crowd of people on the other side who gathered to listen to music and drink coffee, and he had no option. If he said no, they will beat the hell out of him. If he says yes, then everyone will laugh at him. He said, okay, I can dance with you, but you need to clap for me. This is very smart. He said, okay. They put their guns aside and they started clapping. He picked up his slippers and he ran away. They became the joke of the refugee camp. But also there were all types of rumors about his fate. So they ran after him. They tried to capture him, but he was very fast and slim. And there was an orange grove. Sadly, today, many of these groves were cut down to meet the growth of the population and their needs in relation to housing. So he hid there, and there was a high tree that he climbed, and he kept waiting there, and they couldn't find him. But again, my grandparents did not know his fate, so my grandmother started crying for him and looking for him. There were some people who said, oh, he was beaten, he was killed, he was shot, he was tortured. And they couldn't find him. And at the time, there was no phones, smart or stupid. So my father's only way of communicating with his parents was going to a nearby mosque by sunset and making the call for prayer. When they hailed him, they knew that he was alive and kicking. So I speak about this intergenerational aspect of siege and occupation and humiliation. My mother comes from the great city of Bethlehem in the West Bank, from Beit Sahur, and maybe some of you have visited. And she got married. So in 1978, as I said, Palestinians were ironically united under occupation. So my father made a visit to the house of his distant uncle. Palestinians, still cousins and stuff, they get married up until today. And he saw my mother and they shook hands and they fell in love and they got married. And this marriage resulted in 13 siblings, including me, from the same marriage, from the same mother and father. And my mother had to move to Gaza, but this meant that she had to change her address and ID from Bethlehem to Gaza. And this also meant that she needed a permit to visit her own family, which lives an hour drive away. So it took my mother 12 years, from 2000 to 2012, to get a permit to see her own family. And during this time, my mother lost her father in 2003 and her mother in 2008, and she was not able to get a permit to see her own, to participate even in the funeral procession. And that's why I say it's generational. It doesn't stop. And only when an Israeli human rights organization called Gisha petitioned on her behalf before the Israeli Supreme Court, imagine a case like this going to the Israeli Supreme Court, that she got a 4-day permit to see her family, but she overstayed, quote unquote. She stayed 32 days, a day for each year she spent in Gaza since she got married. And she got to see her family. But again, it was a reconnection. Although they lived an hour away, they didn't know, many of them, all her nieces and nephews grew up. She never saw them. And I'm sure she never even recognized many of them. Because again, in 2012, at least in Palestine, smartphones were not that popular. Internet connection was there. I was struggling in 2008 just to organize a video call between my mother and my grandmother so that they see each other. And it happened, but it was really difficult because of electricity outages and internet problems. And again, in 2015, my mother needed another permit to see her dying brother, eldest brother, and Israel gave her another permit only after my uncle passed away. So she applied for a permit when he was struggling at the hospital for his life, but they did not give her a permit. And only after he passed away that she was given a permit. And my mother, I think, is lucky compared to many other Palestinians, because I know hundreds and thousands of people, including cancer patients and people who really need traveling and permits, like students, patients, families, who never get these permits. So in 2019, my mother also got breast cancer, and there is no breast cancer treatment in Gaza because of the siege. She applied to get a permit to go to East Jerusalem, to Augusta Victoria Hospital, and she was given a permit only to Jerusalem. She was not able to go to the West Bank. She was not able to see her family in the West Bank. And she was too worried to violate the terms of her stay and permit, because she needed another permit to have, different chemotherapy sessions. And I know some patients, and actually dozens of them, who get the first permit to have the first chemotherapy session, but not the second permit. And they die waiting in Gaza. Otherwise, Israel might ask them to collaborate in return for permits. So I said that hundreds of people who lost their lives in Gaza because of these permits. My sister was one of them. She was not lucky enough to get this permit. She was 26 years old. She needed a permit to have a minor surgery, which was not available in Gaza, very minor. And then she applied for an Israeli permit because the Rafah crossing with Egypt was shut down. And she kept waiting at the hospital for 1 week. And after 1 week, she got a rejection for security reasons. And this is the codes, every single Palestinians get from Israel. And then she also waited a few more days because the crossing with Egypt was shut down, and her health got really bad during these days. And when she was able to leave with my father and aunt, it was too late. Once she had the surgery in Cairo, she passed away the day after. She lost her life and imaginable potential. She was newly married, young, educated, working as a teacher for UNRWA. Her life, was cut short. And then even bringing her body back to Gaza was a challenge because the crossing was shut down. So my father would drive with an ambulance from Al-Arish Hospital, 50 miles away, in June, with my aunt, to the Rafah crossing, and they were sent back twice. On the third day, they were allowed into Gaza. As they crossed, an Israeli soldier, my father spoke Hebrew very well, because he worked in Israel for so many years. An Israeli soldier asked him, "Why do you cry?" He said, "Because I lost my daughter." He said, "Don't cry, all of us will die." it's the same soldiers who maintain the siege. So I talk about this intergenerational aspect, and I've been doing my PhD for 6 years. Even other contributors, to the book, went through. This story I'm telling you is not unique. It's the story of every single Palestinian family. Other contributors in the book, I know some of my friends, they were denied, permits. They were not able to see their families for even 10 years and more. It's a representation of what's happening to the Palestinian people. So I try to highlight these stories just to take the reader into a journey of what it means for a Palestinian family, which is not unique, to live under Israeli occupation. But also, I'll talk more about this in the following questions, to envision a future away from travel restrictions.
Okay, so one of the things that you also referred to in the beginning of this conversation was about the ongoing Nakba and what that concept looks like in terms of your experience in Gaza and people's experience in Gaza, and actually focusing on Gaza as a focal point. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So Nakba started in 1947, and it was largely carried out in 1948 and towards 1949. But it did not stop there. It was just the start. I mean, the siege of Gaza is only the last episode of Nakba that the Palestinian people have been living since 1948. So my family was kicked out of their village, and it was not over then. They have been suffering in refugee camps since then. Travel restrictions, being split generation after another, being humiliated throughout the years, killed. The Palestinian people have been subjected to humiliation, killing, torture, political prisoners, raids into refugee camps, airstrikes, offensives against Gaza and elsewhere in the West Bank, uprooting Palestinian trees. It's never over. We have always lived with the implications of Nakba, and that's why I talk about the concept of the ongoing Nakba. It's not an event that took place in history and ended. It only started then, and every day we live the implications of this Nakba. And today, Israeli elections took place, and early polls suggest that Netanyahu is going to win and form a government, which will be another Nakba for Palestinians, with land confiscation, building more settlements, and separation and punishment, and probably more offensives on Gaza, military incursions, and more people will be killed. Children. There is a child at a friend's school who was recently arrested, and dozens and hundreds of Palestinian children caged in Israel. So this is the concept that it's not an event that took place and finished. It's something that we live every day. The psychological torture, the mental toll on Palestinians that no one talks about, the natural growth of refugees. If you look at Gaza today, it's a concrete jungle. My brother just left Gaza for his postgrad studies, and he went to Malaysia, and Malaysia is very green. So his first comment was, "It's very green. I've never seen something like this." And actually, I had the same feeling when I got there earlier in 2013. But again, if you look at other aspects, the health sector, the water, 96% of Gaza's water is unfit for human consumption. And so what do the Palestinians do? How do we handle all these challenges and ongoing Nakba that is intergenerational, that is impacting young and old people, regardless? I mean, my youngest brother was born in 2006. He's now 17 in the high school. He has never lived a normal life in his life for 17 years now, let alone talking about the years before. But specifically from 2006, when he was born, offensive started on Gaza when an Israeli soldier was captured, and the power plant was bombed, and then electricity outages and sanctions and siege, and this is his life. I think if I bring him here, show him how nature looks like, how normal people, like people can lead normal lives, he would be shocked. Like even experiencing 24 hours of electricity is something I still try to cope with 6 years later, because even thunder, when I hear thunder, I always associate it with war and bombing. That's why I say it's ongoing. Even if you leave Gaza, the mental health, the mental toll, the trauma we live, it's never over. We say you leave Gaza, but Gaza doesn't leave you.
Well, and one of the things you talk about, it may not be as much in your chapter, but I know that you could speak to it, is what it means to even try to leave to study, or try to leave to go anywhere, and what that experience is like. So I know you were talking about the travel restrictions just to be able to get out, for a moment, but what does it mean for someone like you to go and study, and whether or not you can go back, and what that's like?
Again, I mean, this is another form of exile, I would say, where Palestinians do not have the privilege of going back home because we don't have an airport. So we have to travel through other countries to get to Palestine, either through Egypt or Jordan. Israel is not an option, especially for young people. A lot of people, including myself, get rejections, even we do not try, because we know the answer. So imagine, for example, for students working on a PhD, you cannot go back because you don't want to lose your PhD. There is a high chance that you will get stuck there. And the fact that you have to deal with this, to stay away from your family. I have 15 nephews and nieces, and I haven't seen them for 6 years, and many of them were even born after I left, and we do not communicate very often. I don't know many of them really well. And the fact that you have always to think about what's happening in Gaza. Once there is an offensive, the psychological impact of that, I think it's easier when we are in Gaza than watching Gaza being bombed. Because the psychological impact of thinking about your family and friends is way heavier than actual bombs, I would say. Then listening to news. Whenever there is an offensive in Gaza, we do not sleep. We just listen to news, and then the more you listen to news, the more you get stressed out. So you do not have the privilege of going back or sacrificing your studies. So you have to finish everything before you attempt to go back. And we have to imagine also the implications and the toll resulting from not seeing your family for this long period of time. Reconnecting, the concept I talked when my mother went to the West Bank, she had to reconnect with her family. And I think I will go through the same experience, because it's been 6 years, and I also had a similar experience in Jordan, because I got to see my West Bank family in Jordan, ways to overcome these restrictions. I haven't seen them for 14 years when I saw them in 2014, and I didn't know many of them. Actually, my aunt didn't know me. She kept guessing wrong names, and then she was shocked when she knew that. She never thought that she would see me. But again, the fact that we have to reconnect and to get to know each other again and again, because we never see each other. I might know some people in the US more than my own family, because I get to see them more, for example, or in Turkey or where I live. So we look at the comprehensive picture of isolation, travel restrictions, and what it means for families. And that's why you mentioned that Gaza is always viewed through the lenses of statistics. Yeah, there are 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza. 96% of Gaza's water is unfit for human consumption. But we have to understand the impact, the toll on families, because also this is also a way to connect with these families, to relate to their experiences. This could happen to my brother or sister or daughter. This is us, and we're not asking for something really big, not political. Like, no one talks about the two-state solution because it's dead. But at least we should be able to connect as a family, as a people, naturally, to be able to move freely. And this is, why the book came to surface, is to envision this future, at least
to have the most basic human rights.
So this is my next question, is envisioning a future, and often, I hear like, without the travel restrictions, things would be different. But when you and other people are thinking about envisioning this future, can you paint it out for us? Can you tell us a little bit about what you can even imagine with all of these things that you're also saying are psychologically impacting you constantly?
So 70% of Gaza's population are refugees. So I definitely, when I envision the future, I envision that these refugees will be able to go back to their towns and villages. They do not have to live in refugee camps where Israeli settlers enjoy their lands, in some cases a few meters away. Some refugees can literally see their lands from Gaza. I see a future where Palestinians will have access to healthcare, that people like my sister do not have to die waiting for Israeli permits, that we will have our own healthcare system that is not at the mercy of Israel. That even patients shouldn't have to get a permit in the first place to have medical, care. Where students can travel, they do not have to lose their scholarships waiting for permits again. Agriculture, when we talk about, there is no space in Gaza. What is the solution for people and refugees in Gaza? There should be more agricultural lands and ways to expand Gaza, because the population density is huge, and now in Gaza, there is no green spaces for people. Artificial intelligence could be, for example, used to figure out some ways of connecting Palestinians or improving the quality of agriculture. Planting, some people, it's very popular now in Gaza, they plant the roofs of their houses because there is no space on the ground. Also, I think the intellectual siege is important, where, for example, Rifat was not able to travel. Caging Palestinian academics in Gaza, and the fact that Palestinians cannot connect with the outside world, students and lecturers and university professors cannot connect with the outside world. There should be always a connection, even now when the siege is happening. People can connect online. There are different ways to connect with Palestinians on the ground, provide them with resources, learn from Palestinians. 98% of the people of Gaza are literate, and many with degrees. Like all my family have degrees. My sister, she has 5 kids, and she has a master's degree. And all my sisters and brothers are educated. So education is a thing, and I think Gaza can also provide something to the world. If we look at the IT sector in Gaza, it's growing. And I know, for example, there was this boy of 16 who ended up in the Silicon Valley in California from Gaza. So Gaza can provide something to the world too. It's a change. It's not, we shouldn't be aid dependent people. It's not about aid. It's a political crisis, man-made crisis. And in this process, as I said, Palestinians too can provide something. While envisioning the future where they can be connected as one people, where intellectuals can interact with the world, professionals, we can also, I think, provide problems, not just to, for example, water, the issue of water in Gaza, but also elsewhere. My friend is also an engineer, and he works in water engineering and climate change, and he's very successful. And there are many people like him who can provide solutions to many other people in countries and exchange ideas.
Yeah, I love how you talk about that, because I do feel like even doing work on Palestine for 3 decades, it is hard not to keep internalizing that poor Gazans, poor Palestinians, they're constantly under, but this notion that like there's so much we have to contribute to the world, just let us, be free to be able to do all these things.
Exactly.
It's such a powerful image that I think, folks here, I'm sure online, can identify with. Again, that idea of as many times as we like say the statistics and talk about what we know about Gaza, it's not enough to bring that human part and actually talk about what liberation really is.
Yeah, it is a man-made crisis, and before the occupation, there were people who came to work in Gaza from different Arab countries, and not only this, Gaza seaport has always traditionally, throughout history, been the gate. That's why Gaza, for example, people of Gaza are known to like chili and spices, because spices and chili would come to the Arab world, to the Arab Peninsula, through the ancient seaport of Gaza. There are also documents that prove that wealthy people in Gaza have donated to some other neighboring countries, including in South and Central America in the past, in the 70s, but also before Nakba, where Palestinian wealthy people built hospitals in other Arab countries. So, I mean, this has been the case also in other Palestinian cities and thriving Palestinian cities that were completely destroyed or partially destroyed in 1948. Gaza is just an extension of this reality. So we can be part of the world. This is the argument in my chapter, that we need to bring Gaza and make Gaza part of the world again, so that people in Gaza can benefit. I mean, the tourism sector in Gaza, for example, would be a thing if the siege is lifted, because Gaza got one of the most beautiful beaches in the world, even more beautiful than the beach in Hawaii. Excuse me, my friends there. But this is how we feel about it growing up there. You know, the tourism sector, trade, and agriculture, oranges, the history of oranges and olives, and we can provide the world with a lot of things, but also learn a lot of things. But we need to break the siege for this process to happen.
So I know there are several chapters and all of them are significant and all of you want to buy the book, I'm certain. But I am wondering if you might reflect on a couple of the other chapters that you feel like you could, just highlight for us.
So there is a chapter about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence is used to, control Palestinians. So the automation of war. As I said, growing up, I would always see Israeli soldiers with their red caps breaking into our homes, looking for stone throwers. But now we do not see our occupiers, because everything is automated. Even patrol units at the Gaza fence, and this is how people actually call it. They never call it border, because the majority of them are refugees that they do not recognize it as a border. They call it the fence. So to say to cross from Gaza from the north to the east, or from the north to the south, we say from the fence to the fence. So yeah, going back to your question, the automation of war, how patrol units are even now unmanned. We have drones carrying out the dirty work. It's no longer even helicopters. Sometimes, F-16s and F-35 warjets are used, but this happens exceptionally when there is a major escalation. Other than that, from the sea, there are reports that the Israeli Navy used dolphins to carry out attacks against Palestinians. So again, artificial intelligence and how it's used. The profiling of Palestinians, even in the West Bank and at checkpoints, is happening because of artificial intelligence. Now, the Pegasus scandal and how they also spied on Facebook, and there was a legal case here in the US against Israeli company spying on Palestinians. One of my friends was one of the victims. He's in Jerusalem, and he told me, like, I have nothing really serious, but the fact that they violated my privacy and got into my bedroom, that was the thing that I couldn't take. So we have drones, we have jokes actually in Gaza that because of Israel's surveillance of Palestinians 24/7, Israel could tell if a Palestinian family has fresh meat or frozen meat for lunch. They know everything. And there was a friend of mine who once had to do an interview to get a permit to go to the West Bank. And an Israeli officer asked him, why did you open a new gate in your house? Because his grandmother was, struggling, taking the stairs. They opened a new small gate for her. But they also asked him why. So they know the details of our lives and the surveillance and using artificial intelligence, face recognition at checkpoints, and they sell it to other countries. So they test it on Palestinians, they sell it to other countries like hot cake. And this applies to weapons, but also to artificial intelligence applications, especially face recognitions. And this has been a big thing during COVID, and especially by dictatorships. So yeah, this is, for example, one of the chapters by Noor Naim talking about how artificial intelligence is used against Palestinians, but also how to use it to improve the quality, like the positive side of the Palestinian people. To build, for example, houses, smart houses. But then we have also challenges of electricity. So we have to come, like now, a lot of people use solar energy in Gaza. Because it's more sustainable than fuel and it's less expensive. So this is one of the chapters. Another chapter, I think, Rifat's chapter, since he was here in 2014 and he's a close friend of mine. I hope he's watching online, if electricity is on in Gaza. He also talks about, similar experiences, how his mother, for example, when she was a student going to her school in the 60s, she survived a bomb that detonated as she crossed by. And then how his father was shot at going back from Israel. He was driving a car, and an Israeli watchtower with trigger-happy Israeli soldiers shot at them, and they were injured. Also, I was surprised to know that my friend Rifat also got shot during the first Palestinian Intifada. I never knew that, reading the book. But also, I like how Rifat tries to be always positive. So his chapter is titled, "It Will Pass." Despite all these difficulties and even being denied to leave, he's trying to be positive. He's a university professor teaching English literature at the Islamic University of Gaza, and he's behind training many people in Gaza to write and creative writing and poetry. And we always joke that he hides his Shakespeare novels under his pillow. So also concluding with a very beautiful poem, talking about his friends who were shot and killed, and his family members, counting how many dozens of his family members and his wife's family members were killed by Israel. Not one, not two. Their houses were demolished. He lost his brother. So documenting all these experiences, but also being positive, saying it shall pass. Why? Because we know that the experience of other people, oppressors and occupiers will not be victorious, even if it's tough. We have different stories, different histories. We connect with different struggles. Afro-Americans, Native people, Maori people in New Zealand, Ottawa, and Hawaii, but also in Ireland and South Africa, that the same as our brothers and sisters in Ireland say, our day shall come and we will prevail eventually. That's why we try to be positive. The situation is very helpless and hopeless, but we try to be positive despite this.
I know that there's also a chapter about intellectual siege. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
So again, sieging, if we look at Palestinian political prisoners, for example, many of them are university professors, educated people. I know a prisoner who learned to speak 16 languages in Israeli jails. I know university professors who are jailed But also, if we look at the larger prison, Gaza and the West Bank, and checkpoints, and this system of control, getting books into Gaza. Now we are at a bookstore here. I hope you buy the book too, and other books. Is a struggle. Like, you can get a book within a week or two if you send it from another country, or a month maximum. But in Gaza, it's a struggle because these books go through Israel, and then they're held there. You don't know, like sometimes you get them on time, but very often they're held there for months and weeks and sometimes years. Because of the screening, but also because of the collective punishment. So getting books there is a struggle. And I had experience of founding a library called the Hashim Sani Library in Gaza. And we lived with this struggle. So just to tell you a story, I have a friend who brought a suitcase of books from the US, and she couldn't make it to Gaza. So she kept waiting in Cairo, and then she gave up. She knew she would not be allowed into Gaza. She left the suitcase in Cairo. And the suitcase remained there for 1 year. And when my parents were traveling back from Turkey to Gaza through Egypt, they took the suitcase with them and they brought the books. Also, Mus'ab Abu Toha, in the book, he talks about his experience of establishing the Edward Said Public Libraries and how, so in 2014, Israel bombed the Islamic University of Gaza, including Rifat's office. And Mus'ab went nearby and he found some of these books, including Rifat's books. And he felt sorry, and he posted a picture online on Facebook, telling people what happened. And there were a lot of people who were interested to contribute and donate books, including Noam Chomsky. This is how he started the library, and he got the support of the Said family. Now he has 2 branches in Gaza, and it's expanding. A lot of people go there. So it's challenging, but also if there is a will, there is a way. We try different ways, and it works out. Like, even getting the book into Gaza, life in Gaza, was not easy. We had to send it with some international NGO workers. We sent 3 copies. So I got my copy. Like, usually, if you're in Gaza, you're the last one to get the book. If you get it in the first place, it doesn't get confiscated or destroyed. And it's always expensive, more than other countries to send this stuff. There are also like universities, schools that were bombed. But again, if you look at, and there are different images of houses destroyed by Israel, you always find kids looking for their books. The first thing that they look for after their house gets destroyed, because education is a thing, as I said. And this is also a positive message. So we have a siege, we have the intellectual isolation and siege, where our teachers and schools, and especially also in the West Bank, not only in Gaza, get destroyed or arrested. Students, I remember going to class many times in the high school and before, and we would have like some of the students who were killed in the class. And then we have their pictures, and you can imagine like the trauma we had to deal with. And it happened very often. And it's happening now. Maybe you'll see some of these images from time to time where students get killed. And then their classmates go to school and they found about their death, and it's just very sad for children to experience this. But despite this, there are attempts to, again, challenge this isolation or intellectual isolation. Some of them are successful, some of them are not. But again, we should not stop trying.
So I know one of the things, I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up, but I know one of the themes that I feel like I was reading in some of the chapters in yours and Rifat's, and even Asma's chapter, or the part that she wrote about why we film, like why do we continue to hold ourselves is why you write. In a situation like this, what is it either about the power of writing, or why is it that you continue to write?
So one reason, and I mentioned this in my story or chapter, one reason I joined the English department, because while I was sitting for my high school exams in 2007, I lost my sister, and it was my so we had two different exams, English literature, language, but also grammar. So there were two different papers that we had to write. And I lost my sister on the first day of sitting for the English language exam. So the next day I did not do well. Like I just finished the multiple choice question, then I left the exam. And I got a very bad mark, but I passed still. And I thought, oh, maybe I should study English. Like, my studying English was my way of telling her story and other stories. So I started writing by telling personal stories. And many of my writings are based on personal experiences, either my own experience or the experience of my friends. And writing is healing, I think. In a situation like this where it's very depressing, I find it very healing, but also sharing the stories with people and educating them. I've met, I would say, thousands of people. I spoke to thousands of people in the past 10 years, telling them these stories and sharing our experiences. And it's very painful to do that every time. But I hope that this will bring about change.
So why don't we open it up for questions, and then I know there is one last question if somebody doesn't ask that I want to make sure we do at the end.
Yeah, so is there anyone who's physically present here who would like to ask a question to start us out? Yeah. Great.
Hi, this has been really amazing. But I'm just curious, what about electronic books? If it takes so long for a hard copy book to get into Gaza, I'm wondering, you can just download it.
Yes, but then a lot of people in Gaza cannot afford
A phone or a reader.
to a Kindle, or even to buy the book itself, or to not have bank cards, because opening a bank card is a struggle. And Israel is also watching this. We have to go to banks run by the Palestinian Authority, but the Palestinian Authority also is under pressure. They're not allowed to open bank accounts for everyone easily. So you have to have a job and a salary in order to be able to, not just in the private sector, but like really well-paid jobs by, for example, for the government, in the West Bank, or working for the UN or international NGOs. I don't have a bank account in Gaza, to be honest. I never opened a bank account. I have bank accounts elsewhere in the world, but not in Gaza because it's not easy. It's an option. There's some, I shouldn't say this, but there's some websites, for example, a lot of people depend on that, and Rifat is very good with this, that they hack into books and they publish them for everyone for free, which I shouldn't say this at a book. So,
Also,
We believe in that.
yes. Yeah.
Also, libraries can have electronic book catalogs.
Exactly. So one project that was implemented by the Hashim Sani Library is having PDF books of some books that we could get. So people try to come around. It's not easy. Sometimes they're successful. For example, I have a lot of my friends in Gaza. They send me articles that they want, and I have access to from outside Gaza. So I get them these books and journal articles and send them, them these articles. So there is always a way.
Hello, I'm so glad you're here. My question is just more about how you want it to be received in difference, because obviously we talked a lot about the interpretations, mostly coming from the Palestinian and Gaza voice, but also when it comes to the different audiences that are going to read this. When you think of say the stereotypical American audience, at least maybe people who are coming into it with a little bit more of a progressive mindset versus either Palestinian or people from Gaza, how do you kind of feel like you want it to be received differently for those different populations?
So I come from Gaza. My family ended up as refugees in Gaza, so we're not originally from Gaza. Even calling me a Gazan, by definition, is not true. But Gaza has a special place in my heart because I grew up there and I've seen the injustice taking place there. So it's been always. But also, I want to be viewed as a Palestinian. I shouldn't be like looked at as a Gazan in separation, isolation from the rest of the Palestinian people. That the question of Gaza and Palestine is a question of refugees. That we are not helpless victims, period. Yes, there is a disaster happening in Gaza, and there is a need for humanitarian aid. But the way this humanitarian aid is handled should be considered. That we are political refugees. We are part and parcel of the Palestinian people, and we can provide something to the world. We're not seeking aid or help in the pathetic definition of the word. We can provide something to the world. As I said, there are a lot of educated people in Palestine and Gaza. And we want to be part of the world. We're not an isolated island on the Mediterranean. we have a natural extension. We are part of a nation, also part of the Arab and Muslim world. Part of Gaza has always been on the trade road, part of the world. Like even the old Gaza seaport used to be called Lakhia, would receive people from Greece and Italy and trade. We have always been part of the world, and we want to be part of the world again by providing something to this world, but also exchanging ideas and being able to connect with Palestinians also in the diaspora, not just Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, and even in Israel itself. We want to be one collective, one people, to enjoy our full rights and for people to understand that we have something to provide, solutions, IT, agriculture. I mean, there are a lot of misconceptions and lies of, for example, Israel bringing the best agriculture practices and systems to Palestine, which is not true. If we look at the history of Palestinian farmers and leading the revolution in 1956, but like technically the way they planted their trees and plants, and there were fires in August 22 in West Jerusalem, and many forests were burned, and these forests were planted by the Jewish National Fund to erase Palestinian history. But once they were burned, people were able to see the traces that Palestinian farmers have built for hundreds of years, and all these irrigation systems. So this is how we want to be remembered, that we are part of the world, we are part of a nation, we are not helpless victims, although the situation is very catastrophic, but we also can provide something. And that Americans should take action, because it's, when you talk about Palestine and Israel, it's not a domestic, it's not foreign policy issue per se, it's also a domestic issue, because tax money is being used, American tax money, to maintain this situation. 3.8 billion a year, at least, given to Israel military aid. So this is, I see also part of perception, to take action, not just to look at us as helpless victims and feel sorry, listening to our stories. Because I am here to change this,
Thank you so much. In one of the chapters, the concept of permanent temporality is introduced, and I found it absolutely fascinating. And it reminded you, I've talked a lot about like the generational trauma that is absolutely played out and psychological trauma. And it reminds me of other colonized states. And I thought of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan writer who was exiled, and he had, his stage burned for writing in his own language. But he talked about the whole concept of decolonizing the mind, right? Because once colonization went away, people were still in shackles, so to speak, and enslaved to that mindset. How do you envision that Palestinians can begin to break that cycle of just being stuck in that like permanent temporality that the book talks about?
Thank you for this challenging question. So I think the younger generation now, which is more educated and open to the world, despite the siege, there are different ways to connect. COVID has taught us some of them. It's more into understanding, I think, history, which is decolonial history, which is important for the future. We have, seen in different countries and examples in Africa and elsewhere in the world where national education played an important role in decolonizing people's mindsets, because it starts here. If people believe that they're victims, they are inferior, their colonizers are superior, more successful, they cannot lead a liberation movement. And that's why education is important. And I'll just talk about two examples, one from Gaza, the other from the West Bank. Start from the West Bank, where, for example, young Palestinian intellectual, and this also explains why Israel has always targeted Palestinian intellectuals. The same as they target Palestinians who decide to take guns, like Ghassan Kanafani, for example. Basil al-Araj in the West Bank, he was a young man, a pharmacist, recently graduated from college. He started taking people on oral history trips throughout the West Bank. So he would take people to Jenin and speak about a battle or a historical event, or even agriculture and animals. So knowing Palestinian history and topography and architecture, and then he was assassinated by Israel. Of course, not because of these tools, but also he decided to engage in military confrontations with the Israelis. Another example is in Gaza. I know a young man who spoke 7 languages. We would also organize talks about the history of Gaza, decolonial history of Gaza. And I have learned a lot about the history of Gaza that I was not even aware of. And I conclude with the story. So, my point is that education, decolonial education, is important. And there's some initiatives. We had a book club in Gaza where we meet and read Chinua Achebe, and different books, different literature from across the globe, from Latin America to Africa to the Middle East, and Churchill Island, and Israel. The other example is that there was this young man who spoke 7 languages, and he would gather 50 people every week, talk about, for example, dreams or Gaza's history, artificial intelligence, putting Palestine in a larger context, connecting with other struggles is important. And we've been doing this more increasingly. Even during the Great March of Return, people used mirrors, for example, to blur the vision of Israeli snipers who were shooting at them, with a tactic that was used in Standing Rock.
Yes.
Connecting their murals, you will see them in the book, at least one of them, of George Floyd in Gaza. Connecting with other struggles. I've been to Hawaii and Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it's important, even if we look at the history of Palestine itself and how the British brought more soldiers to fight in Palestine, fight Palestinians in Palestine, and they were killed in Gaza. They have, a cemetery for British allied forces, and some of them are indigenous people. So understanding this context, there are initiatives now, and there are more people who try to read about other struggles and learn from other struggles. So, Algeria, for example, and we always associate with Algeria. You always find the Algerian flag in Palestine all over the place. And if you go to Algeria and you ask them, who are like the most loved people to your heart, they will say Palestinians. So these connections increasingly, and especially by young people, and we would have like discussions about these books during the book club, for example. Read a book and then come and discuss it. So we would read literature from different parts of the world. And as I think Chinua Achebe, I'm not sure if it's Chinua Achebe or it was an African proverb, says, until lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So understanding our history, but also the history of other people is important. And as I said, there are more initiatives to do this at school and outside school. Like there are some lectures, like Rifat, he introduced us to Malcolm X in Gaza, and we read Malcolm X and we discussed the book, and also our own history and Palestinian literature and writers. And, that was very helpful to us.
Well, I think at least this is a good time for your final question.
So I think you alluded to it with one of the questions from the audience, but and I know this is a typical US question to ask, but I'm gonna ask it anyway, is what can Americans do?
This is a good question. And as I said, the issue of Palestine and Israel is a domestic issue in the US. And at least there are some bills in the Congress, for example, that advocate for the rights of the Palestinian people. I know there are some initiatives now also to introduce a bill to unlock Gaza, lift the siege. It's really important if you speak to your Congress people. I met Representative Johnson, and he co-signed some of these important bills. But you also have senators and other Congress people. Make sure that you speak to them and urge them to co-sign into these bills. There is a bill, but both bills were introduced by Representative Betty McCullough to support Palestinian human rights, also to make sure that U.S. aid sent to Israel is not used to torture Palestinian children or detain them. Make sure that they sign into this. But also, I think spreading awareness is equally important. That what we all learned today in this space should not stop here. You can educate other people, your family, your friends. You can share a post on social media, because it's a battle of awareness too. The more people get aware, the faster change might happen. Also, connecting with Palestinians, I think, is really important in your capacity. Like if you're a student at college, join like Students for Justice in Palestine. If you're a church member, make sure that your church doesn't invest in companies that is complicit in the Israeli occupation of Palestine, whether American or international. And there are many of them. If you are, with any other faith group, make sure that make sure that your institution is not complicit. Because the occupation in Palestine is not only maintained by Israel and its bodies and institutions, it's also by international companies working there, socially profiling Palestinians, so providing IT services. Caterpillar, for example, is used to demolish Palestinian houses. So make sure that you speak to these people and bring them accountable. And remember, next week you have election here. You can use your vote. to make sure that you vote the right person in office. I'm not asking you to vote a specific person. You know the story, so you know, like the politics of people is really important. It's not just domestic politics, which is great, but also because you know American foreign policy impacts a lot of people across the globe. So this is my asks from Americans.
And can I just say one more thing? So one other thing that I think is really significant, especially being this book about Gaza, is how often in our language in the US, people will talk about the Israeli occupation and Israeli military occupation and ending that, and we'll talk about 55 years. And often we'll say also the Nakba and ongoing Nakba, but you highlighted it in your article about how, you know, the vision forward is actually addressing Palestinian refugees, and that's the majority of the Palestinian population.
Yeah.
And that be more of our central discourse for anybody who's talking about Palestine, and that really is the
answer.
right, yes.
Yeah, of course. The way forward is the way backward, as I said in my chapter. We cannot talk about the situation in the siege in Gaza without talking about refugees. It's like talking about taxation without representation. It doesn't work. You know, it's irrelevant because it started there, and what is happening today is just, you know, what happened with the Great March of Return tells us that the question, what's happening in Gaza, despite many attempts to divert the conversation to another space and place, it's a question of Palestinian refugees. Without solving this problem, the conflict will continue forever. Period.
So I want to thank you, Yousef, for having this conversation here. Thank you to all the writers at AFSC for thinking of putting this anthology together and getting all of you writers to do it, and also to Karis Books. And I'm going to pass it on to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you to you both. It is a real honor to have this conversation at Karis. I want to let our folks who are watching virtually at home know that they can buy Light in Gaza from Karis by clicking the teal button at the bottom of the screen. If you enjoyed tonight's event and you want to support Karis with making a donation to our nonprofit Karis Circle, you can do that as well. And we are going to say goodnight to our friends watching virtually. So thank you for